The power of a digital model is the ability to be able to see that immediately. So this is really important for us as we work with designers and contractors to be able to change things in the model and understand what the impacts are. And because we work in the community, and we'll get to this in a bit, our changes come thick and fast, because what communities and stakeholders want isn't necessarily what the most optimal thing from a pure engineering point of view is. But to create that optimal engineering and community outcome, you need to be able to change and you need to be reactive. And this is what the digital models allow you to do.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a great conversation with John Carr. John is a project manager with ARTC, currently delivering the Inland Rail project, specifically the North Star to New South Wales-Queensland border segment, which is a once-in-a-generation cross-border civil infrastructure project comprising of brownfield, greenfield, and major floodplain crossings. John starts by telling us about his background as a civil engineer, his passion for managing projects that actually solve problems and give him fulfilment, including some examples of those projects, before telling us what a smart community is to him. We then dive into Inland Rail, and John gives us an overview of the project, some of the challenges he has faced, and gives us some examples of how the regional communities have begun to plan for and invest in Inland Rail. We then discuss what intermodal terminals are, their purpose, and the desire that Inland Rail will increase the efficiency of freight through these types of terminals. John then shares with us some examples of digital models and data collection methods being used to deliver the project and their advantages, before discussing how community and stakeholder engagement has been navigated throughout the project and the advantages of the empirical to analytical data collection loop to show the community relatable data. We finish our chat discussing more about the emerging trend of the empirical to the analytical data collection loop, how important this skill set is to teach to young emerging engineers, and the emergence of a more personable engineer. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, John. How are you today?
Hi, Zoe. How are you keeping?
I am very well. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. So let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you are passionate about? Sure
thing. As you can probably guess from my accent, I'm from far north Queensland. So far north, they call it Ireland, or the west of Ireland. And I'm a civil engineer by trade. Didn't always want to be a civil engineer. Wanted to be a mechanical engineer first because a bit of a love for Formula One and MotoGP. But once I realized what everything else that mechanical engineers had to do, HVAC systems and stuff, it didn't really speak to me that much, whereas doing the civil engineering subjects, because first year of university, we got to do all of them. The idea of building something that was quite tactile really, really spoke to me, and it really, really drew me in. And I suppose you could use passionate. I try to use passionate for stuff like, music and sports and stuff, because I feel like when I'm passionate about something, I'll give to it, even if it gives me nothing back. Sport doesn't care if I like it, but in the working things, I think about things that compel me, really drive me to do something and give me a wonderful sense of fulfillment. And so being in the civil engineering space, from now to then has given me a lot of sense of fulfillment. And my journey started very much in the water sector. So scrambling around in sewers and pipes, rebuilding them, building them from new. And it was my first introduction, of course, to computer modeling, and modeling going forward and integrating. Like one of the very first things I did was used to take old scratchy maps and translate them into digital models that we could flood model for the old water systems in Ireland. And I kind of, as I progressed through my career, I got to do more structural stuff. So again, in that real digital space of building structural models, then using Revit. And it was a lot of fun. And when I moved to Australia, I really kind of kept with water and structures. And then I got a chance to do like quite a big major infrastructure project, which was Toowoomba Pipeline, which was, the ethos of the idea was just so good. They had 2 dams, Wyvenhoe, which is out near Somerset. I think that's where it is. And then you had Crestbrook Dam up near Toowoomba, and Toowoomba was running out of water because we were in the drought. And so were like, why don't we build a pipeline from one dam to the other? Because it is cheaper for us to build that, move the water up, then continue to treat the water in Crestbrook. And I'm like, well, this is a fantastic idea. So I got in, and I like this story because as soon as we built it, it started raining in the 2011 floods. And everyone was like, well, that was a waste of time. Didn't she look at you, all these smart people, and you haven't actually done something useful. And then you fast forward 10 years later, Crestbrook runs out of water and they turn on the pumps for the first time. And it's run for a couple of years now. And everyone was like hailing the foresight to build something like that because Toowoomba has exploded as a community. And then off the back of that, I also got the 2011 floods. Flooding is such a huge impact on my career. I got to go out and be part of the flood recovery projects. So when I was managing the recovery of rebuilding the bridges and the drainage all around Ipswich and Ipswich City Council, this was a role that I took originally just as one of the engineers, and then someone left and they were like, well, can you run it, John? Will you manage it? It shouldn't be that hard. That was my first taste of managing engineering projects. And I don't know if it's because of my accent or the way I talk, but I found that this more relationship-based way of working in engineering, it's like I found the thing in engineering I was really good at. And I really enjoyed it. Like, that was a super project, mainly because every time you showed up, the people were super excited to see you. They're like, brilliant, you're here to fix something. I'm like, that's exactly right. That's what we do as engineers. We tactilely take something, make it better. And I like that. Then I moved into oil and gas. And the rationale behind that was to kind of continue that career in management. But I was always really interested in energy and resources. It's something I hadn't really done in my career. So I spend about 6 years in that industry. And that kind of coincided with the gas crisis and the oil crisis in 2014-15, which really put a lot of restrictions on what people could or couldn't do, and I think back to, why I chose civil engineering was to build things. We weren't building anything, Zoe, or at least not something that, I felt compelled to be a part of or would give me fulfillment. And then the opportunity came along with Inland Rail to take up a project manager role for one of the segments of the line out in the region. And this was something I was very easy to get on board with. No pun intended, because the idea behind Inland Rail, obviously, to give a better freight logistic solution for intercapital freight between Brisbane, Melbourne primarily, but also to the other cities. But this idea that if you sent it through the regions, that this would spur a lot of primary, secondary, and tertiary industry. Places where you could connect to the line would become intermodal terminals. Places where, you would bring trucks with one thing, goes onto the rail, and then it gets shuttled all around the country, very efficiently. And by that very nature of those places existing, then you have like the secondary industries that come off it, and then the tertiary support services. And so coming from the west of Ireland, where there really wasn't much, the first thing I did when I was, 18, 19 was leave. I left to go to college. I stayed in the capital city in Dublin because that's where all the jobs were. There was just nothing there in the regions, and which is always a bit of a shame. And so to be part of a project that actively is trying to create something for the regions in the future is something that I was really, really, really excited about, and brings me great fulfillment. I mean, it's not easy. Don't get me wrong. Maybe not everybody's as quite excited about it as I am or other people are. And that's completely understandable. At the end of the day, we're building a freight rail line, not a kids' hospital. So yeah, there are some limitations, but like that core principle that, in the future, this will aid the growth in a regional area, whether it's Moree or Parks or Gundawindi, there's a potential there. and all the community has to do is just grab onto it. And I thought that was really great. And so here I am.
Here you are. And I heard you speak actually twice now, and both times were interesting. One more than the other, but I can't remember which one. No, just kidding. They were both great. Now, I wanted to get you on the podcast, one, because I wanted to hear your thoughts about smart communities, but two, because I think people are really interested in hearing more about Inland Rail if they haven't already. Me being an engineer, we have the privilege to be able to have you speak at some of our conferences, but people in the community may not have heard of Inland Rail, or if they have, they've only heard really small snippets. But also, one of your presentations, you talked a lot about the technology that they're implementing, that they're using. So that's kind of where I want to go with this as well. So let's just lift up a little bit and talk about smart communities, and then we'll dive a bit deeper into, we can do a bit of a 101 on Inland Rail and then talk about technology. So
that sounds awesome.
What is a smart community to you?
Well, honestly, until I'd heard you talk about it, I didn't even understand the concept of a smart community. I was familiar with the smart city. And for me, that was just, when you're moving around on the bus, tapping onto something, there's just things tracking things, and you're just creating a bulk of metadata. But then when I heard you talk about it, about the idea of a smart community, a smart region, that's when I started to understand, right, there's actually a lot more to this. There's a lot more to this. So, I mean, I started to think about, well, what is a community? So again, I'm from the west of Ireland. I'm from a small, I didn't even live in a town, I lived outside the town. And now in Inland Rail, I work in a lot of the regions. And these communities are, they're groups or towns that I suppose have a unique or defined character about them. When you go to certain towns, you can feel it. You can feel there's a character to it. There's a sense of belonging. And that belonging is kind of created with, different roles and responsibilities within that community, and everybody understands them. And the transition from just a community to a smart community is something where they're trying to use data that has now becoming more and more and more available in order to make decisions on the basis of the community. And I want to kind of, if I can, I want to dig into this a little bit more, because, we as humans, and we've talked about psychology before, Zoe, have this hard wiring to be part of a community, a phenomenal sense of community. There's a wonderful book called Sapiens, written by Yuval Noah Harari, and tracking the history of human communities through time, from, the little hunter-gatherers through to some of the empires that we've had. And a lot of that growth and a lot of the decision-making of why communities did things was driven by underlying principles of this is what the Roman Empire does, or this is what this political ideology drives you to do, or this is what this religion drives you to do. And that was the sense of connectedness within the community, and it helped drive their decisions. And that's true for still plenty of communities, towns, countries today. But certainly in the Western world, what we're seeing is that the communities have become more agnostic towards political ideals or religious ideals, and yet their character still remains. So the question is, well, how do they effectively and efficiently make decisions going forward if some of these principles, these, I won't say archaic, but these older principles start to fade into the background? And I think this is why the smart community concept is so important, because what it does is it gives the idea of, well, we have a lot of, we know we feel things, and we know we experience things together, and we have a lot of data together. Why don't we let the data help guide our decision, so that when we make a decision for the good of the community, we do something that's, demonstrable, it's dependable, and it's something that, reinforces the character of the community and doesn't erode it, because it's hard. So everybody's connected now on social media, and everyone has their opinions and their views, but to move like a group forward, whether it's a small community group or a region or a town, you need more than that. And I think the smart community concept of gathering data, which represents that collective and gives them the option to very effectively and efficiently make a decision, is why I think smart communities is, as certainly as a concept, is something that I think is gathering huge momentum, because people are recognizing, well, this is how we can actually move our community on together. I think it's really cool.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks. That was really interesting, and going from like that community and thinking about some of those things that used to draw communities together and still do in some instances. But then if those things do go into the background, what are those next ties that we have, or that social fabric, which is really interesting. And yes, I've read that book as well, and I really enjoyed it. And I think it got me thinking about those things as well. So no, thanks so much for sharing that. And I think looking at the technology and data aspect of our communities, because it does affect our communities, because I think a lot of people, we're talking about communities and people and, forget about the technology, but it's embedded in our lives now. So we need to have people thinking and focusing on it, so then we can move forward in that, that element of public good, rather than just polarizing each other or getting further and further apart and losing that sense of community within both our local community and then this global community that we've created essentially in the last, decade or 2 or 3. Okay, let's talk about Inland Rail. So can you give us a 101 on what Inland Rail is, just say somebody doesn't know anything about it whatsoever, and then we'll start talking about some of the technology that you've implemented or are going to implement along this, and also community engagement. Sorry.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly the arc. That's the arc I'd like to talk about. So, kind of giving an overview of Inland Rail, and then I'll talk about some of the digital models that we're using and the data collection we're using. And then I'm going to talk into how that has impacted our engagement, because one of the things I really want to explore and talk about today and kind of leave people thinking about it in the back of their mind is this idea that there can be a data relationship between us as engineers and communities if we can figure out clever ways to grasp things that are empirical, bring them to the analytical space, whirl them around like we love to do, and then retranslate it back. And hopefully I'm going to give you an example of that later on. So I'll start with Inland Rail. What is it? It's 2 very long pieces of steel, actually multiple pieces of steel. It's a heavy freight rail line linking Melbourne to Brisbane. It's about 1,700 kilometers long, and its job is to move intercapital freight. As these cities grow, and Brisbane and Southeast Queensland in particular, the demand for intercapital freight, like moving things between one another, for your woolies, your coals, appliances, foods, and then like raw commodities, is growing exponentially. And, if we were to continue to do this on the roads, it would place an undue burden on the state and federal road authorities just to try and keep up with the maintenance and construction of the roads, just to meet that emerging demand. And so the hope is with Inland Rail, this freight line will encourage that all long haul freight is done on trains, much like it's done in other large continents like Canada and North America. And it's done in the region. And as we talked about before, that's specifically to try and encourage growth in those regions with intermodal facilities, that they become the hubs of commerce, and that breeds further secondary and tertiary industries often. It's broken up into about 13 segments, and segments being the kind of the individual projects. So mine in particular is called North Star to Border. So North Star being a small community town in northern New South Wales to the New South Wales-Queensland border, crossing the McIntyre River, and then heading up towards Toowoomba and then down into Brisbane. Now, across that 1,700 kilometres, there are many different types of interactions and ways of building the rail line. So some are brownfield, where there is existing rail line in place, and some can be, highly operational, lots of trains on it, through to rail lines that haven't been used in 50 years. There's also a number of greenfield portions. And the reason why we don't follow rail lines everywhere is because, they don't exist everywhere. There's not that level of connectivity. And so sometimes we need to go through greenfield sections, and these greenfield sections can sometimes be extremely hilly. So you're cut filling through them. You're building bridges, you're building culverts. Some are across floodplains, which have the technical challenge of, being in, quite poor structural soil conditions, but also the impact of flooding on both the rail line and the communities that surround it.
Just want to add, Greenfield, for those, because that's an engineering term, greenfield means there's nothing there now.
That's right. And that's a really important thing. So, for communities who live beside and interact with the rail line already, that would be a brownfield project. It's an upgrade. So the field has already been turned around and the grass is gone. Greenfield is that the grass is still there and remains untouched. And now we plan to come through there where there wasn't been before, And of course, some of the other big challenges are coming down the Toowoomba Range. Very, very exciting with the mixture of tunnels and very, very large viaduct. So certainly from an engineering point of view, that's quite an exciting challenge and pushing the absolute boundaries of what current rail locomotives can and cannot do. And even just the physics and the chemistry of what comes out of the trains as they move. And by that, I mean heat and dispelling heat and working about how things move through tunnels, particularly where you have emergency situations like fire. And it's quite exciting. And it's also a mixture of what we call standard gauge, which is like the spacing between the two rail lines, and narrow gauge, which is as it sounds, slightly narrower, which is up in Queensland. And it wasn't that a shock to the system when I joined Inland Rail, and they were explaining to me, it was like, well, John, what we'll do now is we're going to be able to have trains run across Queensland and New South Wales. So the tracks are the same with the park. And I'm like, well, that's a good one. You make fun of the poor old Irishman joining the rail. Who in their right mind would have two different widths of train tracks across states? Well, apparently we did that. And that even in itself is a quite interesting story, which I'm not going to say in any great length. But
interoperability, for sure.
Interoperability and just connecting people together. So it truly is a connecting rail line, And I like to think of particularly the bridge that that we're going to build as part of the North South Border project as probably one of the greatest rail projects to ever cross the McIntyre River. And that has nothing to do with the fact that it's the only one to ever cross the McIntyre River.
Even though I've heard these jokes now 3 times, they're still funny. You're tired of listening to me rattle off these ones. Well, no, thanks for that. I think you also scored to have, the best part of the project as well, going through Toowoomba, fairly obviously, because all the best things happen here in Toowoomba. So we're talking about a rail line that's going from Melbourne to Brisbane through a whole bunch of regional areas. Can you talk a little bit about some of that activation in those regional areas that Inland Rail is hoping for, or maybe has already seen some of that? Because I know you've talked about that a little bit in the areas that have, already started or are ramping up.
Yeah, well, there's been a few, but I think the one that I will jump and use to is down in Moree, where they are already in the planning phases of building an intermodal terminal. So they looked down to places like Parks that already had that infrastructure. And as soon as Inland Rail was going, Parks started expanding their intermodal terminals, a natural progression. Moree realized quite early on in the piece that the connectivity that was about to come through was a real opportunity for them. And they were some of the very early adopters of the idea that an intermodal hub could happen. And so the first thing they did went data gathering. So, from simple things like, doing the traffic counts in the areas to more expansive things like building the economic cases. And for that, they actually came to Inland Rail for our support, and thankfully through the federal government, they have provided quite a lot of funding for regions to look at how they would connect to Inland Rail. And that could be something like what Moree are doing with an intermodal terminal, understanding what would be the economic drivers around them. What would they put on Inland Rail? What would they move around? What would that look like? Where would they position an intermodal terminal, and how big should it be based on what the economics are telling them? And how much should they be looking to invest, or would they invest, and what would that investment partnership look like? So again, a lot of data gathering has to happen. These things don't happen overnight. So that kind of vision to be part of it and start planning early is exactly the type of activation we were hoping for. And what's good is other communities see that, so Toowoomba, again, is probably more of a straightforward example, with the infrastructure already in place in Toowoomba, particularly with the Wellcamp Airport or the second range crossing. It's almost a no-brainer for putting an intermodal hub there. But again, sometimes it just takes one community to do it for other communities to go, I think this is a real thing, and, our hope is, that other places along the line, like in Gundawindi, they have the opportunity to do this as well. And it's something that they're now spinning up and going, what would that look like for us? And how would we do that? And that's really exciting to see, because it's the proof of the concept. When people actually are spending time on it and spending money and gathering the data and putting it together. And it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. And just for people who don't know what an intermodal terminal is, it's about bringing those different modes together in one place. So you've got those efficiencies. So we're talking about not just, okay, well, that's, a train line, but what other things can be co-located so then they can disperse in a more efficient manner.
That's exactly right. So our idea of a modal shift is that, the long form of freight movement, so trucks doing, 12-hour, 24-hour hauls, begins to kind of fall away. And instead what you have is trucks doing shuttle runs around a region. So, trucks bringing in, for example, cotton or grain as a commodity. Maybe you have a large facility like Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola have a large processing plant, and they're moving just, literally Coke and drinks. But then they're bringing it to an intermodal terminal, which allows the efficient transfer of that loaded commodity, and whether it's a drinks or whether it's cornflakes or a commodity like grain, that's efficiently loaded onto a train. And so what we're looking to do is create trains that are, 1.8 kilometers long, double stacked, that shuttle up and down between Melbourne to Brisbane, which is the main capital freight. And then in between, you've got all this space on the line for shorter trains to do runs. And whether it's a grain train or a Woolies train or a Coles train, all of this becomes possible. And it doesn't need to be just Melbourne to Brisbane, because once you come through some of the other areas, and New Park's been a good example, you have the connectivity to head out to Perth or to Newcastle or to Sydney. There's ways of now very efficiently moving bulk commodity around. And then when it comes to the end of the line, again, there's another intermodal facility where that is unloaded onto another truck and it's taken to its endpoint destination. And then the idea is, or the hope is, that the cost and the time for you to say, put something on a truck, bring it to an intermodal facility where it's changed onto a train. The train does the long haul, fast and flat, hops off the train, back onto another truck, goes to its end destination. And the idea is to beat the time that currently takes and drastically reduce the cost. And if we can do that with this piece of infrastructure, we will entice, the market and the communities to make that intermodal shift that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the digital innovations or digital and data components, and then, community as well.
Yeah, so for us, building such a long rail line and the underlying infrastructure below it, so whether that's the embankment, the culverts, the bridges, the tunnels, the piles, everything is changing the whole way along the line. And if you can imagine just how many drawings would be required to capture all the different types of systems, the different components of the system. So whether that's the embankment or the ballast or the rail design itself or the civil design or the signaling design, all of these come into building a rail system. And to do it just on drawings alone and then to rely on all of those being checked correctly over something that's 1,700 kilometers long is just a gargantuan task that makes no sense. And so we have adopted the use of digital models extremely early on in the piece. And we are moving forward with the use of both digital models and digital models and everything else that would bulk onto them, I'll talk about that in a second, to even move into our procurement phases with the idea of, and I was listening to, was it Christina Savian?
Yes.
Talking about the concept of the digital twin and the virtual digital twin. And that's where we're at the moment. So we have fully built digital models with all of the assets already listed in them. And it gives us a number of things and a number of advantages. The first one being it's easy to talk through with contractors what the system looks like in the 3D space. And it gives us the ability to, extract bills of quantities of how much of things, how long, how things can be done. And we can do that quite interactively. And this is the key point. Because it's such a long project, something that you do in one place impacts something you do in another place. And the power of a digital model is the ability to be able to see that immediately. So this is really important for us as we work with designers and contractors to be able to change things in the model and understand what the impacts are. And because we work in the community, and we'll get to this in a bit, our changes come thick and fast, because what communities and stakeholders want isn't necessarily what the most optimal thing from a pure engineering point of view is. But to create that optimal engineering and community outcome, you need to be able to change and you need to be reactive. And this is what the digital models allow you to do. And then there's another fringe benefit is that not only as you construct it and you track it from a progress payment point of view, the simple logistics of a client and a contractor and a consultant interacting with one another, but building a digital asset. It's a lot of rail line to look after. It'll be quite a task to operate it. So from the ground up, building it digitally so that everything is tagged in an asset in a certain way is part of what we're trying to do. And that's not a super easy task because the rail industry is a very, very old industry. They have, a very defined way of doing things. And it is in that very much, checks and balances because, when it goes wrong and you have a derailment, the loss of the economic loss, but the potential loss of life is a very, very real thing. And so in the rail industry, that safety being so front of mind and the ability to want to check anything and, to want to see it written down is very important. And so to move some of the mindsets across the digital space isn't actually straightforward. But, because it's such a big project, we have time to bring people on the journey. And that brings us into probably the next thing is the interoperability of other models. So, of course, I've got a model of let's say the rail line crossing the river, and here we'll use a floodplain. This will segue into talking about the community. We have bridges, we have culverts, and the way you would normally do that is you would, you run a flood model, you'd work out how much aperture you need, and then you would go and you would design it. And kind of one happened and then the other happened. And then the one happens and then the other happens. Whereas now we're getting close to, where we can almost start running these as a direct inputs. I'll kind of jump into the flood model first. So flood models are generally built up of actually two different types of models. So you've got a hydrology one, which is how rain falls and understanding how storms act, what their bursts are like, bursts of rainfall, how intense they are, how long they are. And the hydrology behind that and flood frequency analysis all thinks about and models what that looks like. And so once you've built your hydrological model, you then create a series of outputs and then you can run a hydraulic model, which exactly as it sounds, it models the landscape, it models the roughness factors, and things that would get in the way or speed up or slow down the water as it moves through the landscape, which is quite complex over large floodplains. And then you get an output from that of how much water you need, how high it is, how much force there is, and then you go and build your bridge. But what we're seeing as literally as the technology is developing, we can now join the hydrological models and the hydraulic models and run them at the same time. So what that gives you is a more dynamic response in terms of what floods you are sending into the hydraulic model. Then the hydraulic model, as it interacts with a piece of infrastructure. So again, this would be whether it's a bridge or whether it's a culvert. We're now finding ways to do models within the models. And so I'll just say what I mean about that. So when you're looking at a floodplain and its hydraulic profile is, 30 kilometers, you can't actually model every little square meter. It's impossible. Like, you can create all the major boundaries like fences, roads, dams, houses. All of those can be quite easily modeled in the grid squares, but you can't do it at a small, discrete level. You have to do it at a big level, or the model just slows down. But again, as the models get better and better, what we're finding is what you can do is you can do mini sub-models. So where you have a bridge placed, you can now run what we call subgrid sampling, and effectively you can look at down to a meter or 2 meters worth of grid spacing and see exactly what that impact looks like. So now, and it's all feeding in at the same time. So it's always a dynamic response. So you're able to check and move things around, and allows you to make a better decision on, well, how long will the bridge be? How low will it be? How high will it be? And height being a real key one here, because trains don't like to go up and down really quickly. So, making sure the grades as you approach a particular height is extremely important. And again, the power here is that ability to be able to finesse the height and then immediately see what the impact will be at a slightly different grade and what impact it would be on the earthwork. So this kind of digital modeling, and all the time, every time you're refreshing, you're creating, a new bill of quantities that can be drawn down. You're creating, the guts of an asset list that can be constructed, handed over, and operated afterwards. And this digital dynamic environment is extremely important for something like Inland Rail, which does have impacts from the community. And so, let's talk about this from an engagement point of view.
I just want to quickly say I really appreciated your explanation. I was also a water engineer. I was thinking about this of, the rain and then how that all works and the modelling, because it used to drive me mad when we used to have to do all this modelling. And I think you did a really good job at explaining that, so hopefully everyone followed along. But also I just wanted to add that when you think about the sheer scale of this, like 1 centimetre or a very small quantity across this whole, even just a short section of this, can make a significant difference to both dollars as well as flooding, as well as all these other things. So I think having that, that decision making earlier on and being able to shift and change things is a really big deal, right? It's a really kind of step change in how we can actually build things to the optimum level, not just in the dollars and the amount of resources that we're using, but then also the impacts on the community. So I just wanted to add that it is quite a significant, change in how we can actually do things from my perspective of having done the very early modelling when I was a grad engineer, and how that then feeds into all these things that then go downstream, all these things downstream of, the modelling, but then also physically as well, and impacts on the community. So thank you for that explanation.
No, you're welcome. I'm glad you think that. I hope everybody else thought that as well.
Reach out if you did it, and you can give John a call and he'll explain it to you.
Well, that's right. And look, that actually segues into the next important point, which is the interaction with the community and stakeholders. So this, probably more than anything else, is probably one of the defining changes to how we do certainly large infrastructure projects, and to a large extent how we do engineering now. We are far more connected than we were before. And, as I took on this project, I'll hold my hand up and say I approached very much like an engineer. And, it was, I could look at the numbers, and I understood the concepts. I had played around with flood models, hydraulic models. I'd built things in structural models. I understood it. I had a language by which everything made sense to me. And then I went out to communities, and communities that, were who experienced floods both physically and emotionally. Because not only do you have the physicality of the water, thundering through floodplains or inundating places and cutting them off for a long time, there can be a real emotional response because it can be quite a catastrophic event, and it can be, loss of land. And in certain things, as we've seen in our past, a loss of life associated with floods. And trying to get my head around it, how people who live in these communities and experience these floods have a very different viewpoint about how things should be built over floodplains. And at the time, you think as an engineer, well, don't worry, I've done the numbers, because we're thinking very analytically. But when you live there, you experience the same thing, but you don't experience it analytically. You experience it, what I like to say, rightly or wrongly, empirically. You know it's happening. You are actually gathering data, but that data is empirical. It's experienced. It's known, but it's not maybe necessarily verified or quantified to a level that we would use it analytically. And so one of the things that we did that I feel like is working is spending time gathering empirical data and then translating that into the analytical side. So, and it was relatively simple things when you think about it, so not just actually going out and talking to people about, well, what were your previous floods like? It was like, show me where the flood came to on your house. It came up here to the window. I was like, can I measure that? So you measure it. How far did the flood come out? Was it here? Was it there? Can I survey that? You pick that up. When you were coming here, did you see, was there anything coming out? Was there a lot of debris? Like, yeah, well, there was here. Well, how much got blocked? Can I measure that? And, you get into conversations about, like, oh, well, the flood came, it peaked at, 12 o'clock. And then by later it was starting to drop down. And we're like, oh, okay. So you're telling me maybe about a 5-hour window of the drop down. Okay. Let me record that. Was there anything else? And they would share stories of, that when you get a call from someone in Texas, which is a place in Queensland, that you have, 24 hours basically to move your cattle before that flood will make it's taken down. So, empirically, they know how fast the flood is going to come. And so we take it and we measure it, and then we translated that into the analytical data. And of course, we have the models, so we spin it up, and then we recreate a lot of the old floods. And so then we went and we told them, right, well, we've recreated the floods, and so we've done the design, and there's the design, and that works. And again, we were met with a lot of pushback. Oh, you're not listening, you don't understand. And of course it wasn't that we didn't understand, we were just looking at it wrongly, because we had taken empirical data and we put it into our models, which we spin up, and we got an analytical answer. And what should we give them? We gave them the analytical answer. And then we're like, this is the problem. This is what we're doing wrong as our engineers. We're not spending the time now reconverting that analytical data into something empirical, something that can be consumed by them. And again, this is where the digital sphere became extremely powerful for us. So for example, if I show an engineer a flood hydrograph, they can, looking at lines on a page, know exactly what the extent of the flood will be. And if I just show them a picture then of a peak flood and the bottom, they can work it, they can put it all together in their heads. But if you're not used to looking at flood maps or graphs, how on earth could you possibly comprehend that? So one of the things we were able to do was first, we animated the floods. So we took the hydraulic model and we basically screen captured the whole thing and worked out how to animate it. And then we did two things with that animation. The first thing is that we did, so there were some people in the communities and the councils who had quite a good grasp of flood modeling, because of course they live in a floodplain. And so we were able to show them rise and fall of floods with flood vectors in them. And the idea being, we were able to track the flow of water as it interacted with parts of the landscape that they understood, and then what it would look like with our infrastructure. And so the conversation would go like this. Well, first, let's look at an old flood. Here's us modeling the old flood using everything we know about the topography. And we look at it. Oh, yeah, that's where that river flowed. No, that river flowed more like this. And so we were able to go back and reiterate. Then we might put our line on it, say the rail line, and go, right, now when we put the rail line on it, here's how those flood vectors either stay or they change. So that was good. And so now we're starting to build progress because they can see what they're telling us we're able to spin it up and then spit it out in a way that they can actually work with. And then we took the next step, which was added visualizations. So, and I'm not talking about, just like a nice rendered 3D image. I'm talking rendering an entire flood from a macro scale to a small scale. We were very fortunate. We literally hired ex-game designers to come in and, use some really advanced pieces of visualization software. And we were, again, the integration of them. We're taking the outputs from, the combined hydraulic models, and then taking the outputs from the digital twin, plugging that in, then using the game engine, the steam engines to pull all this together and actually model an entire flood and the rise and fall of the flood. And then be able to zoom in and say, okay, so Mr. Farmer, thank you so much for your time, a few months ago. And what you did, you told us around, the flood came to here. And so we'd like to show you our rendering of it. And here's what our model is telling us. And here's what it looks like. And so what do they see? They see a flood happening. They see that empirical output of what the analytical, so there's all this like superb pieces of engineering burning around in the background. But what they see is something that they can relate to, this empirical data. And then when they say, oh, no, that doesn't look right. It was a bit more here. It was a bit more there. We go, okay, all right. Yeah, we'll take that. So we go back, spin it up in the model again, which is why my point earlier on about being able to be quickly change things and analyze them and then bring them back into that more empirical state is so important, because then you go, so we've looked at it and sure, yeah, when we move floodwater down here, like what you said, you can see it actually does, and we meet these heights. And then things like adding in, like LiDAR data, dropping that down and being able to see what changes that water wouldn't have for things like, if we know roads going to be built in the future, knowing what that's going to look like. But the key being, we hear empirical data all the time from communities because we are impacting them and they are quite connected. And if we don't listen to that empirical data, we're in trouble because we're missing out on an entire data source. But it's not enough just to listen. You need to translate it into analytics, because we need to be able to do something with it. The power of digital modeling, so moving into the digital space, means you can very quickly complete that level of analysis and be satisfied. Okay, from an engineering point of view, from the system we're creating, this meets our parameters. Now we need to translate it back to empirical, and we need to go back and talk to people about what we see so that they can grasp it. And so this link from the analytical to the empirical and vice versa, I think is the new frontier, certainly for the engineering profession and definitely for major infrastructure projects. And it's really underpinned by the ability to do a lot of this digital modeling. And I think it really fits in the concept of the smart community, because here the community are giving us, raw data that they have. We're making a data-driven analysis, and then we're converting that data into something that is palatable for them, so that when we make decisions, everybody's very clear about why that decision is being made. And, a smart decision, a decision that's demonstrable, defendable, and understandable.
Yeah, I talk about a lot, the stories and the numbers both being really important. I think that's exactly what you're talking about here. And also the feedback loop is also really key, because you can engage as much as you want, but if the community aren't seeing that you're doing something with that engagement, and we're not all going to agree all of the time, but exactly like you said there, that feedback loop is critical to be able to then build that trust, build that, open up that conversation and allow that transparency of decision making to happen. So then you can continue to have those conversations and move it forward, because if we're just confused or annoyed because no one's listening to us, then we can't move forward, and you just get stuck in the state where it's not very fun to be, but also we can't progress in any way. So yeah, no, thanks so much for sharing that. I think it's really key to start talking about how this digital stuff and the community can interact, because sometimes we might, only talk about it from the engineering side. And it makes sense to an engineer that that's, how it's going to work, but you're affecting people's lives. And again, we won't all necessarily agree on the final outcome, but we can see how that decision was made. Okay, I want to zoom into the future now. We're nearly done. We're coming up to time, but tell us a little bit about emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough.
Well, I think this one that's at this idea of empirical to analytical and back again. I think we're starting to talk about it, and it's something that we have to move forward with, I think, at a fairly rapid way. And I think the underlying thing that we're not talking about is, well, if this is the way infrastructure is going to go, and if this is the way the new engineer is going to react, what are we doing in universities and schools to prepare engineers for a slightly different skill set? Because at the moment, I feel like we sell engineering in the STEM space of science, technology, it's maths and it's physics. And for some people that instantly resonates. And, we get the archetypal engineer who is, mostly numbers driven. But what we see in the actual real world is the engineers that have better soft skills, are more empathetic to people, are more creative and adaptable with their solutions, particularly in dealing with stakeholders and scope change, are the ones that are doing better and getting better results, not only for their projects, but also for the stakeholders that they're engaging in. And I think we're seeing the emergence of, the engineer that is far more personable. And I think what we should talk about is the fact that the more personable engineer, the more creative engineer is actually what engineering is. And it's not just maths and science. Like up to the point, I don't know if this is true, but I'll test it on you, Zoe. I feel like if we sold this more creative role, this more people-focused role, at an early age, young women considering engineering would say, well, engineering isn't just maths and physics. It's talking to people. It's solving problems. I'm good at talking to people. I'm good at solving problems. I'm not going to go straight into a law degree or something like that. Maybe this will be, I'm creative. I don't want to be constrained by rules. Well, that's okay. That's a great thing. You should consider you be perfect at it. And I think if we sold the idea of this is what actually engineering is, it's something that I think will protect us in the future as projects become more interconnected. And I think what underlies that is the advancement of our digital tools. See, normally you would say engineers are, going away doing the drawings and their calculations, and it took a lot of time. There was no time to engage. But now as our tools become better and faster and they increase, at an exponential rate, the actual laborious task of going through all the calculations becomes less and less a drain on your time because you have these powerful analytical tools. You can't not understand what's going on because, like I said, you can't just pass over everything to the robots and hope they'll do it right. But, there are some things that you can get them to do, which opens up the engineer to be more stakeholder facing, to be more community facing. Even within engineering systems, mechanical engineers and electrical engineers and civil engineers getting together, but then talking with operators of plants, operators of assets, councils, people who are non-engineers, and being able to spend more time in that soft skilled space, understanding and framing problems, learning to communicate with people and be more adaptable with people, knowing that behind you've got this horsepower in the digital space to really, really spin up. So I think it's those two things. It's the recognizing that a lot of the hardcore engineering is going to be done in that digital space. And that's a good thing. That makes us more reactive, makes us more dynamic. But engineers will be required to do a lot more forward facing. And that requires a different type of soft skill set, a different type of personality. And I think if we start to sell that to, certainly, kids at an early age, and again, particularly, I think women who perennially haven't taken up the roles in engineering at the same level as men. And I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense, And if part of that is because they feel it's just too constructive or it closed in and too by the numbers, it's not. it's so much about being empathetic and understanding these, complex social problems and then being able to translate them. And I think if we saw like that, it would be more exciting.
Yeah, it's the communication element is so important, and changing that narrative is also really important to get more diversity. So not just gender, but I think that will help with that as well, but also different backgrounds and also different people that think differently. And we want to lure them into engineering because we need more people to have these, engineering skills. But there has to be room for creativity, exactly what you said. We're very curious at it as engineers, but then adding that creativity on top of that, then you can make really amazing things happen. And for people and for the communities and the societies, like essentially that's what engineers do. But yes, I agree. Like the conversation has gone down the path where it's, you're boxed in, you do math and, physics all day or whatever. And to me, like that drew me in because that's what I really like to do, but not all day, never all day. But the people side was something that I somehow got, that I was like, oh, I can help people. I can do things differently if I'm an engineer, which is why I chose engineering. But yeah, we need to change that narrative that it's only for, people that love math and science and whatever else, and draw some of the creative people in, the people that are really interested in sustainability and doing things differently and, creating circular economies or even, building infrastructure in a new way or whatever the case may be. And I mean, there's so many different types of engineers as well. Well, John, it's been so great to chat with you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We have gone a little bit over time, but that's okay because, it's Friday and it's fun. I have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Oh, sure. Via LinkedIn, you can just type in John Carr and you'll see my little head there pop up.
We'll put all the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. But yeah, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast, and I look forward to our next conversation, probably at some engineering conference or maybe something else. Who knows?
Oh, no doubt. Zoe, thank you so much for inviting me on. I've had a lot of fun. I've never done a podcast before, but it's cool. It's like having a conversation and a chat. And you know me, I don't mind an old chat.
Oh, really? I didn't notice. Okay, thanks, John. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Bye.
Bye.
The Smart Community Podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.